0850 Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
0345 6060 973, the number to call if you've got a question for our panel. Perhaps you want to ask about the Tory leadership race. Perhaps you want to ask about the tube strikes. Perhaps you've got something else that is burning on your mind that you want to put to our guest tonight. You can text us too on 84850 or tweet at LBC. First up, we're going to go to Callum in Preston. Callum, evening.
Evening, Ben. Thanks for taking my question today. I'd like to ask the panel, with the party leader Keir Starmer sacking ministers who stand in solidarity with striking workers, can the Labour Party still claim to be the party of the working people?
Can the Labour Party still claim to be the party of the working people? Jonn Elledge.
Oh, excellent start. I mean, it's an interesting choice, isn't it? It does feel like, it's there in the name of the party, but Keir Starmer does seem this week to be at pains to stand apart from the RMT and other striking unions. I think we can probably credit that to wanting to create some clear red water, let's call it, with his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. But I do wonder whether he's calling that one right. The mood of the country feels more supportive of industrial action than we have seen in quite some time. I've seen different polls on this, but there are certainly some polls out there that suggest that people, even if they're inconvenienced by the strikes, they do recognise that the striking workers have quite a strong case. And also, everybody's incomes are under pressure at the moment. We're facing an enormous cost of living crisis. We've just moments before coming on air, we're getting hints about quite how big this autumn's gas bill is going to be, and it's looking like it's going to be even vaster than we believed before. Under which circumstances, it's getting harder and harder to argue that anybody should be restraining. It's getting harder and harder to call for pay restraint. It's much easier than it's been in some time to see the argument for pay rises.
Do you think he's misread the public mood then, John? It sounds like you're saying that he's at odds with the public opinion on this.
I'm reluctant to go that far because I have a long history of misreading the public mood. I would never.
But you're not fighting to be the next Prime Minister.
No, and a good thing too. I don't know. I think it is possible he has. I think there is a lot of. I think we're in a very different situation economically from where we were 10 years, even 5 years ago. I think there is a growing recognition that we need to be investing more in public services and that Britain needs a pay rise. So I think there is probably more sympathy with the RMT than there has been for a strike of this sort in many years.
Olivia, has Keir Starmer got this one wrong?
Well, he doesn't seem to, he just, again, seems to be doing almost nothing. He's just sitting on the fence, really. He seems to have decided, I think what he genuinely believes is that they shouldn't be striking and that the strikes aren't called for, but he's not actually prepared to come out and say that. And, you could make quite a good argument for being anti these strikes, saying that it will be inflationary and that there are people in the private sector who aren't very well paid at all and couldn't possibly get a pay rise, they're workers too, and it'll be their taxes paying for public sector pay rises. So I think you can make a decent left-wing argument for being anti-strike, but he's not doing that, and nor is he obviously condoning the strikes. And then when he sacked I've forgotten his name,
Sam Tarry.
Tarry, that's it. He sort of tried to fudge it again and claimed that it wasn't actually because he was standing with strikers. So I think, in answer to the question, he doesn't seem to be making Labour the party of workers, but nor does he seem to be making it the party of anything else at all. I don't quite get what the point of Starmer or Labour is at the moment.
Emily, you agree with that?
I would just say that I do definitely agree with some of that, of course, and some of what you said, actually, John. But I do think that we need to be clear about what happened. From what I understand, he wasn't sacked because he was on the picket line. Other shadow cabinet ministers have been out on the picket line in this during this summer of more strikes and threats of strike action. Angela Rayner, for one, was out with the BMA and out with the rail unions previously. It's because he came up with a policy on the hoof. He came up with Labour policy on the hoof that they would not accept, that they shouldn't accept under inflation pay rises. And that is not a Labour policy, and that is why he was sacked. Apparently, it wasn't because he was at the pickets per se. Pardon?
Bit of a fudge, though.
Bit of a fudge. But I do think that Keir Starmer needs to get off the fence. He needs to put his position forward. Is he for inflation-busting pay rises or not? Is he for unions potentially over the taxpayer having to fork out more for these pay rises. But I think a real issue is with rail is that if we're going to have huge pay rises, and I understand why people want them, we've got huge inflation at the moment, is there needs to be productivity gains. And that's where the RMT is so dishonest. That's where Mike Lynch is so dishonest, because they are keeping hold of many working practices that simply are so antiquated, like Victorian style practices. I mean, we've got, for example, ticket offices where 17 tickets were sold in the last 3 months at some of these train stations. I mean, there does need to be a shake-up. The government shouldn't be agreeing to no redundancies at all. No business in this country would be able to say we're never going to sack someone if costs have gone up. And the railways are only up to 80% of what they were before COVID, so they don't have the money coming from tickets.
It's in the 90s, actually.
There's so
there are
much.
New figures coming up. It's in the 90s.
Antonia, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm not on business and commuting, which is where the money's made.
Let's bring Antonia. Do you have sympathy with the strikers, as Emily right?
Yeah, I have a huge amount of sympathy with the strikers. If you kind of map out the contours of what's going on here. Last year, we saw record lows in terms of the number of customers actually using trains, and yet we saw rail companies in this country take home £500 million in profit. And what has the average person seen, or the average RMT worker? They've seen prices for rail travel go up, they've seen profits go up, and they've seen wages stagnate. When you have that as a trio, that is a direct transfer of wealth from the worker up to the boss. So I have a huge amount of sympathy for them. But I kind of agree with what a few of the other speakers have said, in that, Starmer's initial pledges when he was first elected as Labour leader included strengthen workers' rights and support trade unions. That was, one of the things that he stood on as his flagship policy. And you have to ask now, how long has he been Labour leader? Well over 2 years now. And, we all work very closely to policy, and yet we cannot, between us, name the general direction of travel for the Labour Party at the moment. Is it the party of the workers? Is it a pro-business party? What exactly is it? And, I do have sympathy for the fact that, of course, you need party discipline. You do. And actually, particularly within Labour, if you look at what's, happened in Labour over the last 5 years, there's been huge rifts within the party. You do need party discipline. But on the other hand, you do have to zoom out as well and ask, in the cost of living crisis, with high levels of public support for the strikes, where exactly are Labour's loyalties?
OK, let's go back briefly to Callum. Callum, what's your view on this?
I don't really know. I'm a member of the Labour Party myself, actually, and it's things like this that make me question my membership. I think, what's just been said about the general direction of the party, the pledges that Starmer made when he came in as leader of the party, we're heading towards a general election. In my opinion, Labour have never been closer to winning an election, certainly not in the last 12 years, as they could be now, especially with the government that we've got in charge at the moment. And it just feels like we're lagging behind, and, we're not as far ahead in the polls as we should be at this point. And I think that this exact issue is one of the reasons for it, because when it matters, I worry that the party aren't coming out in support of the very people they're supposed to, and that makes me really
Callum,
sad.
thank you. Thanks for your question, Callum in Preston there. Let's go to Southampton. Simon's calling from Southampton. Simon, your question to the panel. Good evening.
Evening, guys. Right, so is the current state of this country actual living proof that the Tory ideology of small state and low taxes is bonkers? And please don't insult me when you reply by talking about magic money trees and who's going to pay for everything.
What do you mean by the state of the country, Simon?
Well, the whole country is up in arms at the moment because our NHS is on its knees, everybody's striking, people can't earn enough money. This isn't just because of recent events. This is just the bubbling over of stuff that's been brewing.
Nothing's working. Nothing's working, Emily. Is this the fault of Tory ideology?
Well, I'm not sure which small state, low tax country he's talking about or what government he's talking about. We've got the highest tax burden in over 70 years. We have a growing state, not a smaller state. And if you look at the NHS, for example, 40% of day-to-day public spending is spent on that institution. Does he want that to go to 50, 60? Where does he want more taxes to go?
Why are we in such a mess then, if it's not because of that?
Well, I'm not saying that our government has necessarily been competent over the years. I would personally argue that we've not had productivity gains, which I would argue that the government should be more committed to a smaller state and more committed to a smarter tax system, a less burdensome tax system. look again at regulation and where it's imposing extra costs on businesses and individuals, because let's remember that it is the private sector where wealth is created, which is made in order to fund our public institutions that we all rely on. So I would argue that we haven't actually tested that model of a small state.
What about austerity,
low
though?
tax.
It's some of the problems we're seeing today come back to the spending cuts, the funding cuts that we saw for much of the last decade.
Yeah, I mean, in some areas, spending cuts were made, particularly in local government, with the budgets that are there. There were hard costs. There were costs. Lots of the Conservative government did cut costs, and the argument was then that we couldn't afford it. The problem is that we haven't had economic growth over the last 10 years. It's been so slow, and then of course the pandemic hit, and now we're trying to recover now. And in order to do so, the government is going to have to make big decisions, and they're going to have to make radical reforms in order to get growth back up and running, because it's been for too long that we've had 1%, 2% growth. That's not good enough.
Okay, Olivia?
I'm afraid I agree with almost every word Emily says. I'm not sure it was a good idea getting us both on the show. But I'd like to add to it, really. I mean, the idea that the NHS is on its knees, which seems to be the crux of the caller's issue, because it's underfunded, surely we can at this point say that that's ludicrous. Like, as Emily says, such a massive proportion of public spending is going towards the NHS.
That doesn't mean it's enough, though. You look at the waiting list, you look at the shifts that doctors and nurses are having to do.
It's a mess.
They need more, don't they? They need more money.
They don't need more money. The NHS needs urgent reform, and it's just ridiculous the way it's become such a taboo that we're no longer able to talk about it. There are layers.
Spent years on urgent NHS reform. That was the whole first term.
Sorry?
This government spent the first term doing NHS reform.
NHS reform.
Andrew Lansley moved a lot of the deck chairs around. This is the result.
Yeah, exactly. They were moving deck chairs around. They weren't ever properly addressing the issue, because for too long it's been politically impossible to be honest about, I mean, even boring, but the state of the IT. None of the computer systems are linked up. If you visit one hospital and you get a treatment there, then you go to another hospital and they've got absolutely no idea how you've been treated or when or anything. So I think the idea that just plugging more and more money into the black hole of NHS funding without changing anything fundamental about the system is absurd.
Antonia, you're shaking your head. Is this about Tory ideology?
So, direct answer to your caller's question, yes, it absolutely is. The Tories have been in power for 12 years in this country, and if you look at every aspect of our society, it's in crisis. Housing, crisis. NHS, crisis. Climate, crisis. Even democracy, in crisis, right? So you may be able, if you're minded to support the Tory party, to explain one or two of these things away, but ultimately the buck has to stop somewhere, and it has to stop with the Tory party, and this idea that we haven't gone far enough with low tax. We have the lowest corporation tax in the G7. We have a lower corporation tax than, for example, California, and nobody would say that, California isn't a hub of innovation and growth and all the rest of it. And then also we have to zoom out as well and question this kind of accepted argument that lower tax equals more growth. The reality is frankly not true. If lower tax equaled more growth, then Somalia would be richer than Sweden. And of course it isn't. Actually what matters is investment in public infrastructure, properly levelling up the country, addressing the cost of living crisis, etc., etc. So in answer to your caller's question, it is absolute proof that the Tory ideology has failed.
John?
This government spent its first 5 years cutting not what it should have cut, but what it was politically easiest to cut, which meant cutting back a lot of capital investment. It meant hacking local council budgets to bits, while, as has been noted, leaving the NHS budget. It didn't keep up with NHS cost inflation, which runs ahead of general inflation for all sorts of reasons, but it was less restrictive than other parts of the... Now, there are all sorts of reasons why when people talk about the Japanese lost decade, Japan grew more in its lost decade than we have grown over the last 10 years. And there's been a complete disaster economically. And the but for that certainly has to stop with this government. I think the lack of investment in those early years is clearly a part of it. But, it's all very well turning around and saying, well, we haven't properly tried Conservative ideology, but at some point you do sound like the left talking about communism.
Socialism, the failed idea that never dies. No, I was just pointing out to the caller that I don't believe we've had a low tax burden. You can point to corporation tax, but the overall tax burden on businesses and individuals and the regulatory burden in this country is very high, and it's one of the reasons why in a lot of countries in the EU as well, who also follow this similarly social democratic model that we have, are also suffering from very low and slow growth.
Emily, very briefly. The point that Antonia and John were making is whether or not it's Tory ideology, the Tory party has to take responsibility. It's been government for 12 years.
Yeah.
The
No, I
problems
totally
we're now
agree with
seeing
that.
are down to them. Liv, do you agree with that?
No, I completely agree with that.
Okay. We are going to go to back to Simon very, very briefly. Simon, in a sentence, what do you make of what you just heard?
Half of it I agree with, half of it I don't. Here's a mad idea. Why don't you tax the wealthy and the rich a little bit more? Well, actually, tax the wealthy and the rich a fair amount and leave people like me that are borderline on benefits alone. You see, this is the thing. You filter the comments of low tax. That always filters down to the poorest in society. They think that they're going to save a quid. Well, and the reality of it is that it's actually the millionaires and the billionaires that are going to save millions and billions. And that's why this country is in the state it's in.
Simon, thank you for your question. Simon in Southampton there. Lots more of your questions, your calls coming up in just a moment. The time now, 8:19.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross question. Tweet at LBC.
8:22 the time. With me in the studio, Olivia Utley from the Telegraph, Jonn Elledge, the journalist and author, Antonia Jennings, the political and social commentator, and Emily Carver, columnist for ConservativeHome and head of media for the IEA. Our next question comes from Robbie in Chelmsford. Hi, Robbie.
Hi, evening all. My question is, as Martin Lewis referenced the other day, I believe Lordless now, there is an increasing risk of civil unrest and civil disobedience on a widespread scale due to the cost of living spiralling out of control and people's wages not matching inflation, continued depression amongst society. What do you think, as a percentage, if you could, is the likelihood that we see widespread civil unrest within the UK in the next year?
OK, Robbie, thank you. Antonia, widespread civil unrest, is that something that's really on the cards?
I think it's possible. The scale of the cost of living crisis is absolutely massive. Just today, some research showed that around half of us are cutting back on our food, 40% are struggling with energy bills. That's predicted to rise to 8.5 million households in fuel poverty after the price cap rise in October, and alongside that, 2.6 million children in poverty. And these trends are set to get worse and worse. And frankly, just like we're seeing with the train strikes and potentially, the upcoming summer of industrial action, we may well see consumers ultimately, of energy using the power that's at their disposal. And that is potentially a mass movement that's recently, for example, the one that's recently emerged, such as Don't Pay UK, or some other civil disobedience kind of collectively using power en masse to to basically just say no, because we're in a situation now where we've had 12 years of the Conservative Party, and sorry to keep mentioning it, but that is the reality, and we're now in a position where every year we're just being asked to accept a lower quality of life. And when is this going down? When is this going to stop? It's seemingly forever. There's always something just around the corner, whether it's, we just needed austerity, we just needed Brexit, Corona, there's so many issues. And I think people are seeing that alongside that, corporates' profits are soaring and they're saying enough's enough.
Whatever people's issues, though, civil disobedience, that is a significant thing. That's a step too far, whatever your gripes are, surely.
Well, I don't think it's a step too far. We have the right to protest in this country, and that's
civil disobedience. So that's distinct from protesting.
Do you think? I
think it is.
In my mind, it's doing something that I guess technically is illegal, such as not paying your energy bills as part of a movement. I don't think it's necessarily, smashing up the Houses of Parliament or anything like that. I think it's just something that is not, something between is not quite the status quo and is maybe full-on illegal action.
Okay, Olivia?
It wouldn't hugely surprise me. I think the cost of living crisis has only just begun, and I think that news that the average energy bill in the UK could rise to £4,000 by next year is really deeply alarming. I think that the failure basically comes down to very poor long-term planning. Our energy has been far too reliant on Russia, and there have been so many ways that we could have been, storing our own energy over here, letting the market, find the winners in renewable energy itself. That would have helped. Fracking would have helped, and it's probably now too late to do anything about that. So I think it is quite possible that we, civil disobedience, it depends exactly what we mean by it. I'm not sure if there'll be...
Let's ask Robbie, shall we? Robbie, what do you mean by civil disobedience?
So civil disobedience, I agree with the previous speaker. That would be things like not paying bills, etc. However, I think in the terms of civil unrest, what I was referencing really briefly was the idea that many different disillusioned groups from the left, from the right, are rising up and actually going out to protest. Specifically, someone like myself who's never protested against anything, maybe starting to be inclined to, which means those that protested against things during the pandemic, etc., may now be radicalised to the extent where they would do civil unrest in a more sort of meaningful way.
Thanks, Robbie. Emily?
I think it is worth reminding ourselves that we went through 2 years of on-off lockdown that essentially shut down large parts of our economy for extended periods of time, while supply chains were massively disrupted, while monetary policy was extremely loose, i.e. there was huge amounts of quantitative easing going into our economy, which has led to an underlying level of inflation that's been spiked by huge rises in energy costs due to external factors that aren't necessarily the fault of our government per se. Having said that, there are long-term reasons why our cost of living is so high in certain areas. In terms of housing, which is coming to a crisis point, I would say that a large factor for that is our very stringent planning regulations, which are not allowing us to build the number of homes that we need. In terms of childcare, which is a huge cost, many women's wages nearly all of it ends up going on childcare in those first 2 to 3 years of their child's birth. We have very stringent regulations when it comes to that. In terms of energy, I think it's true that we haven't had long-term planning, and security of supply has been put at the altar of net zero.
The question about civil unrest, though, do you think civil unrest, civil disobedience,
there could be riots.
Do you think it would be justified, given everything you've just said?
I think there could be riots. In the August months, it does tend to heat up in August. We've seen riots before in the summer months. We haven't seen so far yet. We've seen, obviously, industrial action. It may well be that people who can't... At the moment, we've had sticking plasters. The government's been, handing out multi-billion-pound packages to people, £100 here and there, to help with energy bills and so on.
Would it be justified? Is disobedience and unrest a justifiable way of responding to those
issues? The UK is not alone in suffering the consequences of inflation. If you look at Europe, the average inflation at the moment is something like 9%. And in some countries, it's even beyond that. There are countries that had more tight monetary policy, that didn't quantitative ease in the same way that we did, who aren't suffering from this bout of inflation in such a way.
Okay.
But
John?
I think some people will probably riot. I don't know if they're justified to do so.
Okay. John?
I have a book to sell, so it's quite tempting to say I'm in favour of civil disobedience, and I hope of going massively viral. But
Go on, man.
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think any of us can know. But I think we have.
Unless it's you doing the writing.
At my age, my back will give out. But I do think there are, for all the talk of how it's not only Britain that's going through this inflation, there are a lot of factors that are specific to Britain as well. We have before the financial crisis, we were one of the most productive countries in Western Europe. Now we're at the very bottom of the league table. We had a series of back-to-back crises because we didn't just have the financial crash, which hit us unusually hard because of our large financial sector. We then had austerity. We then had Brexit. Then we had the pandemic, which is global, and then we had the Ukraine crisis. So some of these are affecting everybody, but some of these are things we have brought upon ourselves. And the result of this is we have had
That's slow growth rather than inflationary pressures.
Yes, but the two things feed into each other, don't they? The point is, what was that slogan that George Osborne used to like to use? We didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. It has been pissing down for the last... I'm getting in trouble for that, but it has been raining for the last 12 years and we have done nothing.
Apologies. You are going to get in trouble with me, John. Apologies for John's language.
But it's got worse and worse and worse. And, I actually agree with a lot of what the more right-wing members of the panel have said about housing or about our failure to plan for the energy needs of the future. This government has been in power for 12 years. It was their job. They have not done it. And it's still quite recently they were trying to blame the last Labour government. At this point, it is abject Conservative Party failure that we are in this situation. I have no idea if there's going to be civil disobedience. But if there is, I think much of the blame is going to lie with this government.
Liv, just very briefly, do you agree with that?
Well, I think civil disobedience, I'm not quite sure what people would be protesting against.
But about the point about John's point about the only people to blame were the Conservative Party.
I think the Conservative Party holds some of the blame, but I completely agree with Emily that there are plenty of reasons. The cost of the coronavirus has been huge across the whole of the world. The cost of the war in Ukraine is obviously huge as well. And I agree that the government hasn't responded particularly well to those events in some cases. But I think to say that the entire fault of the situation that we're in now is that of the Conservative government.
It's true, John, isn't it? There have been big external global factors.
Of course. I mean, I'm not going to attempt to blame this government for COVID. But we are in a worse position than many of our competitor countries because of actions taken by this Conservative government.
Thanks, John.
Time is running
Okay. In a moment, we're going to ask the panel what they make of the the Conservative leadership race. First, though, 8:31 the time. Let's get some news headlines. Lottie Morley.
Sam Tarry has told LBC dozens and dozens of shadow ministers and Labour officials will be sacked if they're penalised for showing solidarity with unions. The shadow transport minister has been sacked from Labour's front bench after joining the picket line in rail strikes earlier today. TV cameras will be allowed into the Crown Court tomorrow for the first time in legal history. It follows a change to the law in England and Wales, which was introduced in 2020 but was delayed due to the pandemic. And the Women's England team will find out who they will be up against in the final of the Euros this evening. Germany and France are playing in Milton Keynes for a place in the final. LBC weather, dry for most of the UK this evening, patchy rain in the north of England and in some central areas, and a low of 10 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
8:34 is the time. With me in the studio for Cross Question, Oliva Utley from the Telegraph, Antonia Jennings, political and social commentator, Jonn Elledge, journalist and author, and Emily Carver, columnist for ConservativeHome. Let's go to Muswell Hill, shall we? Michael's calling from Muswell Hill. Michael, evening, your question.
Oh, hi, Ben. I'm just wondering whether the panel think that the likely election of Liz Truss, very deliberately espousing right-wing policies to appeal to the party members, is a direct and a mirror image of Jeremy Corbyn and his left-wing views appealing to the Labour Party membership. And in that victory, the middle ground, the electorate as a whole, will see themselves being deserted, and it's going to destine the Tory party for a period in opposition.
So the members choosing a leader that the public doesn't like, are they taking that risk, the Tories, with Liz Truss? Antonia?
I guess I'm a bit split on this, because on the one hand, the leader of any political party is always chosen by their membership. I guess one of the key differences between the Labour Party membership and the Tory Party membership is firstly around their size. So we know that at their peak, or they've lost a lot of members recently, but Labour had around 600,000 members. The Tories won't exactly tell us how many members they have, but we know it's somewhere between 100, 150 kind of thousand members. And what we do know about their membership is they are completely unrepresentative of the population. If you're a Tory party member, you're much likely to be older, richer, and based in the south of the country than the average person in this country. So I think it's been very interesting to see how the debates have panned out on the television, and the kind of tension between the obvious pitches towards the Tory party membership and then the pitches to the country. And I do think it's a bit of a sad indictment of where we're at when we look at the Tory party debate, and, you know, we are going through a real once-in-a-lifetime fall in income, you know, cost of living crisis, etc. And the debate is really focusing on a race to the bottom with regards to tax cuts. And we know that any of the tax cuts that are being proposed, whether it's, you know, a cut in corporation tax, Rishi Sunak's national insurance thing, you know, etc., we know that they're going to do nothing for the absolute poorest in our society.
On Liz Truss, though, Michael's asking about Liz Truss. Is she as unelectable as Jeremy Corbyn twice proved to be?
Well, in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn got the biggest swing to Labour that they'd seen since the Second World War. So I challenge perhaps how unelectable he was.
He lost 2 general elections.
Yes, he did. I mean, I don't know, you know, the polling is interesting around how well Liz Truss does when faced with the public as opposed to the party membership. Yeah, the indications are perhaps not well. And the final thing I'd say on this is what we have seen across the globe, really, whether it comes to Jeremy Corbyn, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, we've seen a rise in authenticity as a currency within politics. And you know, you can think what you want about those individual leaders, but that has really risen up in terms of people's value set. And so, yeah, when we're looking at Liz Truss and, you know, with that authenticity question, I guess I'm not quite sure it's there.
Emily, can Liz Truss win a general election?
I think it's quite interesting just to point out that, of course, it was the Conservatives at the last election that mobilised support amongst Labour working class voters, whereas the Labour Party sucked up votes among the university-educated Liberal metropolitan in large numbers. So that is something that may not remain if Liz Truss is in power. I'm sure a lot of those Labour voters that did switch to the Conservatives may not stay blue.
Do you mean they've made a huge mistake in getting rid of Boris Johnson? Is that what you're saying?
That was my view, yes, and it probably continues to be my view when we're left with 2 continuity candidates. I think Kemi Badenoch was exciting, but whether she was ready to be the Prime Minister of this country, I'm not sure, from lack of cabinet experience. But I do think that there's little to choose from, which is why they're having this race to the bottom on the tax cuts, because there's not that much between them in terms of policy. They both were in Boris Johnson's cabinet and they both sung from the same hymn sheet. Having said that, Liz Truss does appeal to the membership more than Rishi Sunak at the moment. She is more of a traditional small state conservative in some ways. She was, of course, a Liberal Democrat, so she's very liberal in terms of questions of immigration probably, and also in terms of deregulation. She's very economically liberal in a way that perhaps Rishi Sunak isn't. But in terms of appeal to the general public, I think it's going to be very tough for the Conservatives to win another general election.
Do you think they can win the next general election? In a word.
Maybe.
Okay. Jonn, I've said many times on this show that I think it's ludicrous that we decide, we give the control...
I would say Keir Starmer isn't putting up much of a fight.
Okay. Or that we give control of the keys to Downing Street to a small group on both sides of very unrepresentative party members. It's a stupid way of choosing prime ministers and leaders of opposition, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it feels pretty crazy to me, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon. I don't know the exact year it happened, but I believe the Conservative Party reformed its rules to do that, certainly this century.
How did they do it before? Because Labour does the same.
It was the choice of the MPs.
Just the MPs. So it's actually got broadened out.
Yes. Well, but has it though? You can argue this one either way, because there's literally more people. But, say what you like about MPs, their job is to represent their constituencies. Right. So they do have to think about things other than their own views.
So do you think the members are less representative than the MPs are?
I mean, I think it depends what issue you're looking at, but I think you can certainly argue it either way. I think we heard a lot during the Corbyn years that Labour's members were less representative than Labour's MPs from both within the Labour Party and beyond it. I don't see any reason to say anything different about the Conservative Party. And we don't know much about this electorate. It does feel very strange that the next Prime Minister of this country is being chosen by probably about 150,000 people who we think are generally older than the average in this country.
This is what everyone wanted, though. They wanted him out. They wanted Boris out, and this was the impact.
That's a measure of quite how well he did in government, isn't it? I mean, I don't think you can really blame the people who wanted him out for this system. I think Boris Johnson really only has himself to blame there. As to Liz Truss, I think she's quite unpredictable. I mean, Dominic Cummings refers to her as the human hand grenade because he is very good with a nickname. But as her opponent right now does keep saying, she was a Liberal Democrat, she was a Remainer, she is now neither of those things. I think her politics is actually harder to pin down than Rishi Sunak's. Rishi Sunak is a very straightforward, small state.
Politics seems to keep changing.
Yes, but I think that may be because her opinions generally keep changing. I mean, people who work with her say that she does think about stuff. Okay. She does change her mind. So that can be a very admirable quality in a politician. It could also be an absolute disaster. I think there is one way of finding out.
We will see. Olivia, Emily says the Tories made a mistake here, that Kemi Badenoch would have been a better candidate. Others might say Penny Mordaunt would have been as well. Do you think Liz Truss is somebody who can win the Tories in the next general election?
Well, I think that to say that she's the right-wing equivalent of Jeremy Corbyn is not really right. I don't think that anything she's done so far has actually been particularly reactionary right-wing. I agree with lots of what Jonn says. Her politics seems to change quite a lot, and she seems to think about issues quite deeply. But if you look at what she's actually talking about, she's talking about supply-side reform for a pro-growth, small state, low-tax economy. That is centre-right opinion. That there's nothing reactionary, mad right-wing about that. Socially, she's very liberal. She was a Liberal Democrat, as we've heard. She's very pro-immigration, etc. So I think to sort of pigeonhole her as a kind of far-right candidate is very unfair. Separately, how she's going to go down with the electorate, personally, I find her a bit odd, a bit weird, which might be a bit of a problem. I think Kemi Badenoch, who I very much liked, and Penny Mordaunt, who I don't particularly agree with, both are more sort of charismatic characters who probably would have gone down better personally with the electorate.
So the MPs have got it wrong?
I think it's more... Yes, I think the MPs probably did get it wrong. I agree with Jonn, actually, that in some ways I think that the MPs are a fairer electorate than the Conservative membership, because they want to keep their seats ultimately, so they want to keep their constituents happy, and in some ways that's quite a good way for democracy to work. But yeah, I think they should have given the membership a wider range of options, and I think they perhaps see these people so close up every day that they don't quite understand how they come across on a personal level to the general public.
OK, Michael, thank you. That was Michael in Muswell Hill. Our next question comes from Andrew in Birmingham. Hi, Andrew.
Good evening.
Evening. What's your question, sir?
Yeah, what can the police do to make women feel safer, and how do they prioritise that?
What can the police do to make women feel safer, and how best can they prioritise that? Emily?
Well, I mean, as a woman, obviously, street harassment is something that I've experienced and a lot of women experience when they're out, particularly when they're on their own, walking in the evenings, and it is something that's horrible. I would be wary, though, of knee-jerk legislation. We already do have legislation in place that is there to protect women from continuous harassment. I remember when the Sarah Everard case obviously blew up massively in the media, and there was lots and lots of discussion about what could be done. There were all sorts of proposals, for example, having, plainclothed police officers in nightclubs and so on, and more surveillance, and a lot more authoritarian measures to keep track of women's safety.
But if those things work and they keep women safer, what's the issue?
Well, because I do worry about a policing of human interactions to such an extent. I believe that there needs to be quite a high bar for something to be a criminal offence, because you are essentially allowing the state to coerce someone as a result. Someone could get a criminal record, they could go to jail, they could be fined, etc., by the state. So I do think there has to be quite a high bar. I think wolf whistling or catcalling, however unpleasant and however much we do not take it as a compliment, most women do not, I don't think that should be subject to the law.
Why not?
Why not? Because
it makes millions of women feel threatened and feel scared and feel violated.
But how do you?
Why shouldn't it be illegal?
It's so subjective often, and it relies on how someone feels and their feelings beyond putting a motivation on someone. So, for example, I could be really insulted and intimidated by someone saying, "You look sexy or beautiful" or whatever. I don't think that should be subject to the law.
Okay.
And I think most people would agree with that, particularly at a time when we're not even prosecuting rape very often.
John, do you agree with that?
I mean, for fairly obvious reasons, this is an area that I will know less about and have less personal experience of than anyone else on the panel. And it's not my policy area. I haven't looked into it. But one thing I would say is I do think, particularly the Metropolitan Police at the moment, have a fairly big trust gap with the city as a whole, but especially with women. I'm sure, I've no idea if anyone else in the room was at the Everard Vigil. I was not, but my partner was, so I heard first-hand stories of it, and there was a sense that it was over-policed, that there was no recognition of the fact that the women of London needed to express their shock and horror and frankly to grieve, and I know many women came away from that vigil feeling like they were treated like the enemy. I think it is very difficult to kind of look at a force like the Metropolitan Police and say that they currently have the trust of women in the city.
OK, we'll hear from Antonia and Emily on this in just a moment. The time now, 8:47.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Mick Lynch, who is, of course, the boss of the RMT. You have somewhere in the region of 80 to 90,000 members. They are not allowed to vote on this deal, and your 600 reps are. Why can't the 80+ thousand have that vote?
We consult our members, and that's exactly what we've done.
Isn't that for the man or woman working on the railways, risking his or her life? Isn't it for him or her to decide?
We're very satisfied that our members support this dispute because they're here in their numbers. Our members are out on strike, fully supporting the union's position.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
Hey,
Cross Question on LBC.
Depending on where you live.
8:49, Andrew in Birmingham asked what the police should be doing to make women feel safer and how they should focus on making that a reality. Antonia.
So, I agree with everything pretty much that's actually already been said. I don't think knee-jerk legislation in this space is the right thing to do, you know, speaking personally, and I think on behalf of many women I know, having plainclothes police officers in bars and clubs is frankly quite terrifying. And why is that? That's because of what Jonn was saying, and it's a point around trust. You know, if we want to trust the police with keeping us safe, then we have to, in the first instance, trust the police themselves, you know, and the reality is that through COVID, as we've discussed, we saw the Metropolitan Police dragging grieving women away from a vigil, which was, you know, frankly horrific to watch. And then alongside that, we see again and again, and frankly, unfortunately, it is most often with the Metropolitan Police, we see exposés of WhatsApps between police officers, etc., in which they're saying the worst kind of things about women. You know, things that you wouldn't really believe anyone would say, let alone someone that is employed by the state to keep us safe. So I think it's a question, first and foremost, about building up trust between women and police. And in terms of what that looks like, I think there's a big job around getting women into the force. So I think, you know, more progressive recruitment practices are definitely needed, and also making the police more diverse across all metrics. So, you know, outreach to BAME communities and the many, many other communities, unfortunately, that do not feel kept safe by the police.
Liv, how much is this about enforcement, about policing, and how much should it be about cultural change and men changing the way that they behave without having been forced to do so by the law?
Yeah, I think it's probably more about cultural change, definitely. As we were sort of saying, that men aren't doing it because, you know, they're not really thinking about the law when they're doing it. They just don't perhaps understand how it's making people feel. I agree with a lot of what's been said about trust in the police being the main issue. I don't think more laws is what we need. I think what we need is more trust. And I think that, you know, Sarah Everard is a very good example, but I think generally massive over-policing during lockdown has made people feel anxious around the police. And stories of people being arrested because they were going for a walk with their friend and holding a cup of coffee or whatever. Personally, I find myself twitching whenever I see a policeman now and sort of think, oh God, am I wearing my mask? Have I got all my
because of that
place? Am I supposed to be out? Just over those 2 years, seeing a policeman and thinking, I'm sure I'm breaking some sort of law, it gets ingrained in your mind.
Because we didn't wear our masks.
Because we didn't wear our masks. And I genuinely think it does that sort of over-policing in loads of respects, and the vigils was another aspect as well, has made it feel as though, which I think Jonn said, that the police are sort of the enemy and not on our side at all. So I think that's a cultural change which could be addressed. But I think that those sort of things, and sort of helping to educate young men is more important than sort of enforcing more and more laws about more and more specific.
We've seen campaigns like that. Sadiq Khan did a campaign. There's been a campaign involving the Liverpool players. Do you think those sort of things have any impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably do, and I think already the younger generation of boys who are turning into, you know, young men now have been educated about this far more at school. And from what I've seen of friends' younger siblings and stuff, you know, 10 years younger than me, the treatment of girls in schools, for example, is so much better than it used to be. And I think the calling out of, I think, you know, occasionally these movements go a little bit too far, but definitely the movement of calling out sexism in schools, etc., probably in the long run is going to feed into a much more healthy culture between men and women in the future. But it is all going to take a while.
What I would just say is we don't want to sterilise interactions between men and women too much. You know, you don't want men to be so fearful of saying anything, that a compliment that could be deemed, sexist or misogynistic.
Andrew in Birmingham, thank you for your question. Text here from Jenny in Devon. The World Health Organization have advised today that gay and bisexual men limit their sexual partners in response to the monkeypox outbreak. Is this justified, or is it unfairly singling out this group? Antonia.
Sorry, so is the caller suggesting that off their own volition that
yes,
gay people are reducing sexual contact?
They're being advised to reduce their number of sexual partners, presumably to stop the onward transmission of monkeypox. But it is specifically gay and bisexual men who have been given that advice. Is that justified, Jenny asks, or is it unfairly singling them out?
So I'm not completely on top of the monkeypox story, but from what I do understand, it is more prevalent in gay and bisexual men. So as a piece of advice around healthcare, that does seem to be apt essentially. But what I would say is, as we saw with the AIDS epidemic and a lot of other issues of all sorts in their nature, not just healthcare issues. When there is a particular community that has a particular issue, we need to be very careful that we don't, as part of trying to make that community safer, also stigmatise them as well. So I think it's quite telling, if I'm being candid, that frankly I don't know about monkeypox and whether it is particularly prevalent in gay and bisexual men. As I said, I kind of think I've seen something, but the fact that that's not very publicly aware and we're not all on top of that as a very important news story, I think says a lot as well.
Emily, should authorities like the WHO be telling anybody what they should do in their sex lives?
Well, no one has to listen to them. I mean, the WHO, I think, does overreach and does get things wrong quite often. We saw during the pandemic that they didn't think it was transmitted in the way that it was at the start, and gave advice to that extent to all countries. But I would just say that this advice just sounds like common sense. I don't think it's hopefully stigmatising gay men.
Advice to specific groups, you don't have any issue with it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if that's where it's most prevalent, and if it's passed by, I don't think it's actually passed by sex per se, but it's from closeness, close physical contact, then it seems pretty common sense to sort of, perhaps be a bit careful with who you're, sleeping with.
Okay, Jonn?
I mean, I'm very boringly going to agree with everything that's already been said. I think it is perfectly sensible to look at how the disease is transmitted and to speak to the most at-risk groups. And it does seem to be more prevalent among men who have sex with men. There is a reason they are being prioritised for the vaccine as well. I think it is something that needs to be handled carefully because there is a risk of stigmatization. I think we're currently seeing more of that in the US than we are seeing here. But as things stand, certainly gay men in my life seem to be quite are pushing this messaging because it is important. They do not feel stigmatised.
Are they? So it's going around, people are thinking about it.
Your friend of mine, Owen Jones, has spent the last 2 days sat on the internet basically saying, no, this isn't homophobic, this is an important public health message.
Okay.
I'm willing to defer to Owen on this matter.
Olivia?
I was going to mention Owen Jones as well, actually, because I agree with everything. I'd go further and say that not issuing guidance like this at a time like this would probably be quite homophobic. If I was a gay or bisexual man and I didn't hear anything from the WHO because they were sitting there worrying that it might be homophobic to warn me not to have sex with lots of partners, and then I got monkeypox, I would think, why wasn't I given that sensible public health advice? So I think, being overly cautious and sort of tiptoeing around a really important public health matter like this for fear of offending actually could end up being very discriminatory in its own way.
Okay, that's from Jenny and Devon. We are going to go now briefly to Jonn in Golders Green. Back to the Tory leadership race. Jonn.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I would just like to ask the panel whether they think it would have been a better process to offer the Conservative membership a full selection of candidates, and then they pick the final two and present them to the MPs. Obviously, you would have probably, in all probability, got two completely different candidates. Probably Penny and probably Penny and Kenny.
Okay, thanks, Jonn. Jonn Elledge.
Absolutely not. That sounds like complete madness to me. We have a parliamentary system. Whoever wins, the point of the leader of the governing party is that they can command the majority of the MPs in the House of Commons. That is how our political system works. That is the first thing you need to be Prime Minister of this country. It is no good the Conservative Party membership returning someone who cannot do that, and that would have been a very real risk. And we saw the dangers of doing this on the other side of the House in 2015, 2016, where Labour MPs did not back Jeremy Corbyn. They tried to get rid of him. Labour Party rules at that point did not allow that.
Okay.
And we had years of chaos in the Labour Party.
We are short on time. Briefly, Antonia.
I'm not sure. I do take John's point about our parliamentary system. I guess the one thing that I really would have liked to see from the Tory party leadership process is that it was expedited. Frankly, it's going to drag on over close to 3 months. And meanwhile, central government is in paralysis, as are all of our arms of local government as well. You know, we have, for example, as Johnson's flagship policy agenda, the Levelling Up, mission. We have a department named after it. What's going on for the next 3 months with that? You know, and alongside that, cost of living, etc., etc. So what I really would have liked to see is that the process was a bit quicker.
Emily, briefly.
I think it sounds fun. We would have got a better two candidates.
Would have
Well, a
been
more
more
fun,
interesting,
dynamic two candidates at the end.
I'm up for it. Liv.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it would be much more fun. And we know what the electorate would have liked.
Sounds good to me, John. John, thank you. Last question, William in Barnet. He says the 99p McDonald's cheeseburger is now going to be the £1.19 cheeseburger. What's your McDonald's order of choice? Liv?
3 chicken selects and chips.
Good shout. I was going to say the same. Emily?
Oh, God, 5 chicken selects and chips.
And
a milkshake.
And a milkshake.
Honestly, probably a selection of McFlurries.
Selection of McFlurries. Yeah. Straight for the dessert. Like it. John?
As is clear from looking at me, I only eat salad, I'm afraid.
Good answer. William, thank you for your question. Thank you to all our panellists tonight, John, Emily, Olivia and Antonia. Coming up after the news, we're going to be talking about women's sport. Great success for the England women's team last night. The Lionesses really paving the way. Or are they? Ian Wright, Arsenal legend today, saying if this doesn't inspire girls to take up sport, what will? Are we doing enough to encourage girls to take up sport? And if not, how do we do it? That's coming up after the news.
From Global... Lottie Morley. Most train services have now finished for the day following more strikes across the UK's rail network. The RMT union has been walking out in a row over pay and jobs. These people at London's King's Cross station have told us they understand why.